So according to commentator and former Labor Party factional operative Graham Richardson, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews is probably the best politician in the country right now. Richardson's own biases aside, the few remaining Victorian Liberal MPs probably believe him, which makes Dan's talk-to-the-hand response to the recent corruption scandal surrounding Tim Pallas all the more jarring. The good treasurer was recently discovered to own shares in massive toll road company Transurban, one of the darlings of the stock market, generating annual returns on equity approaching 17.5%, or super profits, to use the language of the Labor Party. Big deal, you might think. Transurban is a blue chip investment on the ASX. Thousands of Aussies hold them in their portfolios. Their dividends are increasing at a rate of 7% each year on top of the capital growth, which is up 19% since October last year. Their revenue is incredibly stable, and with governments long ago abandoning their infrastructure responsibilities, the future of privately built public assets looks bright. Almost all of their prosperity has come from toll roads, both domestically and overseas, all of which have been designed, approved, and in some cases even partially financed by governments acting on behalf of their citizens. In 2014, the newly elected Victorian Labor government actually tore up one such contract, the East-West Link, at a cost to taxpayers of more than $1.2 billion. Politics aside, and there were serious questions to be asked of the previous government as to why they would sign such a consequential contract just months from a state election, the Andrews government actually paid more than $1 billion to undo years of planning on road infrastructure. But it did retrieve a big bucket of votes in the inner east and north, residents who have the luxury of inner city tram access, but couldn't possibly countenance such a backwards suburban piece of infrastructure in or even under their backyard. With both parties engaging in irresponsible taxpayer-backed bluffs and billions of dollars in road spending on the table, it's not surprising that Transurban approached the new treasurer Tim Pallas after his election in 2014. Their unsolicited proposal for what is essentially the western part of the East-West Link road corridor would be built and operated by Transurban, obviously, for a massive concession on existing tolls on the M1, as well as the ability to charge new ones on the new road. It wouldn't complete any missing links or open up any new corridors, but it would keep the Green voting north on side, while putting the project in a hard Labor voting territory. Everybody wins. So Dan Andrews and Tim Pallas tore up a contract for an arterial road at a cost of $1.3 billion, only to then turn around and start tearing up the suburbs of their core constituency on the proposal of one of Australia's biggest companies. One the treasurer who signed the contract had a direct financial interest in. Government contracts like these are the best kind of work you can get too, because the word over budget basically doesn't exist. I'm old enough to remember when Mikey was conceived. A $500 million contract awarded to a little-known startup called Camco that ended up costing $1.5 billion and being more than 5 years late. Vivian Miners, the chief executive of the Transport Ticketing Authority, which was the government body making these decisions on the public transport ticketing project, owned shares in the company that owned Camco. His wife worked for them. Labor's record with big government contracts has been nothing short of appalling. You got pipelines between rural and metropolitan Victoria that lay unused for years after their construction. Ditto, a desalination plant that cost this state $3.1 billion, 3.5 billion, and eventually $4 billion to build, immediately put on standby, and yet still cost taxpayers more than $1 million every day just to have. For every item Labor have promised, they've delivered a disaster. But Tim Pallas had complied with all relevant laws and guidelines, and I quote, "That really is the end of it," unquote. You can't negotiate with a company you part own, Dan, and guess what? Since investing $4 billion into this contract, they've extracted more than $37 billion in concessions from the taxpayers of Victoria. Their share price has increased 19% since October last year. They've received a massive windfall from this contract, and it's completely unacceptable to say, talk to the hand when such core principles of good governance are under assault. But I guess Tim Pallas would put that down to, quote, swings and roundabouts, unquote, in the share market, right? Not unless you help Transurban build them, Tim. This whole matter needs to be referred to Victoria's independent, broad-based anti-corruption commission right now. It's about far more than the fact the rabble of remaining Liberals after last year's wipeout will finally get a political foothold. It's about supposedly the most left-wing government in the country using the levers of power to enrich themselves, whether intentionally or not. And I make no judgments on their motives. But it was Labor that introduced fixed 4-year terms in 2002 in the assumption that citizens having less power over their parliament would result in better governance outcomes. It was a terrible idea then, and it's a terrible idea today, leaving corrupt, indifferent and incorrigible MPs invulnerable to scandals of their own making. This whole scenario is a disgrace, and if our Treasurer, Tim Pallas, doesn't do the right thing and resign, the Premier should sack him.